Welcome back to more essential information on Express Entry. I'm Mark Holthe. I'm not alone today. Alicia's going to join me to talk about something that you guys just are not hearing about, and you need to. Yes, Canadian experience is a wonderful thing, but just when you think you've got it, you may not. Tune in just a second. Well, Alicia, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm well. The snow's falling in Calgary, but it's still a beautiful day.
I know. What can we expect? It's winter, but I'll tell you, it has been a very, very dry winter. We have not seen nearly the snow we've seen in the past, but this is Canada. It's winter, so we expect snow. All right. Well, today, this Express Entry topic is something that not a lot of people are talking about. And I'm grateful to bring you on. And Alicia's written a blog post that you can click on in the link below this video. So if you're not grasping everything we're talking about, head on over to our website, read her blog, and it has links and everything else that will take you back to all the things that we're showing you today. So, Alicia, I think a lot of people who follow us know what Express Entry is. They know you get points for Canadian work experience, but there are little aspects of this process that can really trip people up, especially when they think they've got it and they're working away and they're burning up, say, their post-grad work permit, and then they realize, oh, wait a minute, this ain't going to work out so well. So why did you choose this one, Alicia? I love asking this question.
Yeah, I try to write blog articles about things that are happening to people in real life. And one of the things that came up for even for lawyers is, can you work in these circumstances or not? Is that authorized or not? And a lot of this is very technical information, but it's absolutely essential, just like you said, because if you don't meet every single little aspect of the definition of what Canadian work experience is, and it is a defined term in the ministerial instructions, if you don't meet that, you're not going to be eligible to get your Canadian Experience class application. So that's what we're talking about today. And I wanted to start with actually all the way back at high school. So sometimes people are asking, well, I've got a child or somebody who's maybe getting to be around age 18 and they may or may not have a study permit. And sometimes the question is, well, if they were here working without a study permit and they do apply for a study permit and they're authorized to do that, are they then going to be able to work?
Yeah.
Can a high school student work in Canada? Are they able to do that on a study permit? So that's the question. And I wanted to start there because it's not something that you often see. So
No.
the answer is actually in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations when you're looking at who is authorized to work without a work permit. So it's Regulation 186 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, and only certain foreign nationals, so I will add, of course, this is for foreign nationals, um, only certain people are authorized to work without a work permit. And in some circumstances, if you have a valid study permit, you are authorized to work. And those sections, it's a big regulation, so you've got to keep
Yes.
scrolling down. So one of them that we will talk about is sub F, but that's on-campus work. The other one is sub V. So if you keep going all the way down through the alphabet here, you'll find sub V. So 186 sub V. So only if you have a study permit, you're a full-time student enrolled at a designated learning institution. So far you're okay if you're in high school because all high schools, all primary schools and secondary schools in Canada are automatically designated learning institutions. That's another question that comes up. But
Yep.
that's the first one. The second one is where things start to go off the rails. So the program in which they're enrolled is a post-secondary academic, vocational, or professional training program. And right away, if you're a high school student, you're not in a post-secondary academic, vocational,
Yeah.
or professional training program.
You're
And the other,
secondary. Mhm.
you're secondary, you're not post-secondary. Yeah. The other aspect of sub V, sub II is that the duration of the program has to be 6 months or more, and the program has to lead to a degree, diploma, or certificate. So if you are a high school student, you don't meet the eligibility parameters of 186 sub V, and holding a study permit alone is not going to authorize you to work part-time during or between your classes. So no, the answer is if you're a high school student and you don't meet the parameters of sub V, that study permit's not going to be what is authorizing you to work.
All right. So one stricken off the list. And there was a time where these high school students could actually get a work permit. Do you remember those days when things were booming in Alberta and all of our foreign workers who were working in skilled occupations, not only could their spouses obtain open work permits, but their dependent children could as well. I think Ontario also had a provision to facilitate that. And then the world shifted and changed, and that's definitely not the case now. But it was a brief little foray into authorizing high school students, which technically on those work permits could have granted them eligibility for Canadian experience, at least within the Canadian experience class. All right. Okay. What do we got next here?
All right, so I thought I'd kind of go through the logical progression of now, all right, let's say somebody is out of high school and they've gotten into a designated learning institution and they're going to be attending a post-secondary program. Well, COVID's happened. So there's been a few circumstances, many circumstances earlier on, where most of the schools closed, they shut down. And a lot of people were left wondering, can I still work on my study permit if my school is closed? Or let's say I've had to take a medical leave from my studies. Can I work while I'm on a medical leave? And unfortunately, the answer to this is no. So this is actually in immigration's program manuals, and it's their interpretation of what constitutes full-time studies. So we'll pop over to study permit, assessing study permit conditions. And this is part of immigration's operational instructions and guidelines. So it's their interpretation of the regulations. But
And
you'll
that's
see
key,
there's,
you guys. That's absolutely key. So obviously, if you don't want any pushback, you don't want to have any problems, then do exactly what they tell, what immigration is telling you to do on the website. Follow exactly what those instructions are. But these are still their interpretation. And as lawyers, sometimes we like pointing out that the interpretation they've given it might have a different interpretation, one that sides with our clients. So those are some of the fun things that we do. But generally speaking, yeah, we want to pay close attention to this and do exactly what it tells us to do. So, all right. So which one do you want to hit first here?
all right, so we're going to be looking at the, yeah, the section that goes to J. So working on or off campus, not authorized during any leave from studies. So they specifically say if your school has closed, you cannot work on or off campus. So either under 186 sub V or sub F. Sub F is the on-campus work, because you're not considered to be a full-time student, and that break in studies, the fact that the school had to close because of COVID, is not a regularly scheduled break. And then if you look at sub K, that same thing applies to co-op or internship holders as well. So if you applied for your study permit and you also had to apply for a work permit that's specifically a co-op work permit, guess what? That's not authorized work, even if you're holding that valid co-op work permit if the entire school has closed down.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is going to be tough for a lot of people who are trying to look to qualify for permanent residency under Canadian Experience Class, because if you have unauthorized work, you're not allowed to rely on that to calculate your hours of Canadian work experience. The other issue is that if you have unauthorized work, you've got to be truthful about the fact that you've got unauthorized work.
And it's interesting, Alicia, because we really should have done this in that crazy frenzy that existed right before the TR to PR pathway program. Because, during that time period, some international students wanted to claim work experience while they were studying, but they could have actually been in this type of a situation. And so some unwittingly may have filed a TR to PR pathway claiming work experience, which really wasn't valid work experience based on these regulations. Now, when it comes to the Canadian Experience class, which is kind of the gist of our topic today, and your blog post that you wrote, this isn't included anyways. While your work on a study permit isn't included, it has to be at least the postgrad work permit or another open work permit. You can't claim work while full-time studies. But it's interesting because I wonder how many of our viewers have filed TR to PR pathway, and then through the 2020, when they're trying to claim that, that 20 hours towards the full year under the essential worker programs. I wonder if there might be some that are caught by this. And of course, click on the link if you think you might be in that situation, and book a consultation with Alicia.
Yeah, because the important thing, I wrote this in my blog article too. I kind of wrote it in a question and answer format, but this is legal information, and this is not meant to be legal advice in the blog article. It's meant to be information, and
Yeah.
it's really important to talk to a lawyer if you need to have specific advice about your situation and how it applies to you based on your life circumstances.
Yep. That's the caveat. There you go, folks. All right.
So picking up on what Mark was saying there is, all right, even if your school didn't shut down and you were properly attending classes, and let's say, you escaped COVID without having any sort of shutdown in your classes, which I don't think generally happened, but theoretically, if you were a full-time student and you were able to continue to work part-time, you can't claim that part-time work experience while you are a full-time student as Canadian work experience either. And that's because of the ministerial instructions.
Yep. All right. So did you want to touch on the ministerial instructions now, Alicia? Should we pull those
Yeah,
up?
we can pop over there.
Okay, let's take a peek here. So we'll just remove that one there. So if we go to the ministerial instructions right here, and which section, Alicia, are we going to
Stay there
target
for
first?
stay
Oh,
there
stay
for a
here.
sec, Mark, and I'll just
Mhm.
show them. So the ministerial instructions are actually authorized by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. So Section 10.3 of the Act gives the minister the ability to make these instructions as an annex. And so these change. So just keep in mind that you've got to figure out what the most recent version is. Right now, the most recent version is the June 23rd, 2021 version, but you've got to go back to the website and check what the current version is. So that's one thing to think about those express entry ministerial instructions. But if you look in here, this is going to give you a bunch of technical information about what qualifies as Canadian work experience. And to find that, you've got to scroll all the way down to section 15. So that's where we'll head right now.
And it's just like any law. It will take a while to find what you're looking for. We're just about there, and 15. Here is Canadian work experience here.
There we go. So Canadian work experience, it first talks about how you assign points. And then if you look further down, yeah, so it'll talk about for the purposes of this section. So this is 15 sub 3. This is important. Canadian work experience is a defined term. So they say it's work that has to be acquired in one or more skill occupations O, A, or B of the National Occupation Classification Matrix. And we'll come back to this. I've got one thing we'll touch on at the end again. It's got to be full-time work or the equivalent of part-time work with one or more employers. And it's got to be within the last 10 years from the day on which you're making the application. So it can't be older than 10 years. And you have to have earned wages or a commission for that work. It's got to be paid.
Yeah. And
So those are the
one thing I'll point out too, Alicia, is for a lot of people, if you're claiming work experience that's quite old and you submit your profile and you do your points and your calculations and you think great, and then you're one of those outlanders, who's waiting for a no program specified draw. Well,
Mhm.
maybe a year has passed. Yes, your profile may have lapsed and you might have to put a new one in. And so then you think, I'll just put all the same work experience in. It's all good. And if you're really trying to claim as the bulk of your work experience stuff that happened a long time ago, remember that it can drop off. And so you always have to pay attention to that the work experience that you have is fully within that 10-year period, immediately preceding the day in which you basically submit your profile. Or in the case of this, the interesting part, Alicia, is that this 10-year period, it extends all the way to the point of filing your EAPR. And people don't realize that. Only your birthday is locked in at the issuance of the ITA. So if you're not paying attention and you know that your work experience is dropping off, those precious 3 years of foreign work experience you need, some of you may need to make sure that you're well prepared to file that application as soon as you get that ITA so that you don't lose work experience on the back end as that 10-year period slides forward all the way up until the date it locks in when you file your EAPR.
Yeah, that's a super good point, Mark. So that's kind of the overarching requirements, but keep scrolling down. So we've
Yep.
got the requirements in order to be assigned points for Canadian work experience. And I don't go through this a lot in the blog article. I'm mainly
Yep.
looking at, what the definition is for further down here. But you also have to specify what your not code is, and you've got to perform the main duties in that lead statement, and
Yes,
then the majority of the main duties in that knock. So I know Mark's talked about that a lot. If you
for
keep
sure.
scrolling down, we've got at least 30 hours per week. And this is important. So I do talk about this in the blog article.
Yep.
So what happens when you've got 40 hours a week? If you're a lucky person who didn't have your hours reduced during COVID and you were working 40 hours a week, can you kind of stack those hours and get to a year before a calendar year actually occurs? And the answer is no. So you've got to make sure that within any week period, whether you're looking at one full-time job or you're looking at a combination of part-time jobs, as long as they're knock A, B, or O, and you're doing what you said you need to be doing for meeting that knock. However, you can't stack those hours. You can't. So
Yeah.
let's say you worked 20 hours in one part-time job and 20 hours in another part-time job, you're still only getting credit for 30 hours in that week.
Yep. Yep.
So that's really important. So if you're working more than one job, when you're trying to calculate your hours of Canadian work experience, make sure that you're not piling up 2 or 3 jobs and then saying that you have more than a week's worth of work experience in any given week. So cut it off at 30 to be conservative. And then in terms of the work experience itself, there's what we just talked about. How do you know when can you start claiming your work experience? Well, if you are still a full-time student, even if your school's open, you can't claim any sort of work experience while you're a full-time student on a study permit.
Yeah. And this is an interesting part, Alicia. I'm not sure if you've covered it in your blog, but I had someone come back and say, okay, well, what if I hold a post-grad work permit that's still valid, and then I go back and get a study permit to go back to school because I couldn't find a job and I decided I might as well just keep studying. And now I want to claim the work experience because I'm actually working full-time while I'm studying full-time, which, Alicia, is perfectly acceptable. There's no law against that if you hold the authorization for it. But you can see here, so it's during which, so for the purposes of this section, a period of employment during which the foreign national was engaged in full-time study. So it doesn't say holding a study permit or otherwise. It says that they're engaged in full-time study is not to be included in calculating a period of work experience. So, as lawyers, we could try to infer or confer that, well, implicitly, that means you hold authorization to study, right? But if you also hold authorization to work, you're fully complying with both conditions. And I think it's arguable maybe that you could you could do it, but I'll tell you, I would never advise a client myself, given this provision, to try to claim work experience, full-time work experience on a postgrad if they went back and got a new study permit. It seems absurd that we even be talking about this, but the pandemic has created this situation.
Yeah. And yeah, to be conservative, if that person is engaged in full-time study, they're not able to claim work experience for a
Yep.
Canadian experience class. I think immigration officers would be able to say the plain reading of the ministerial
Yep.
instructions is that engaged in full-time study means because of policy, right? They don't want
Yep.
people trying to,
Do
as a
both.
policy
Yeah.
matter, do both full-time because it's extremely difficult and it's really hard for students to focus on their studies
Yep.
full-time if they're trying to also work full-time.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's one thing is the next thing is, well, what about, let's say you're going to graduate. And I did write a blog article and we did a YouTube video about this as well, right before the TR to PR, because this was something that was coming up a lot. There were a lot of students under the International Grad Stream. That program was announced and they were scrambling to try to get proof of
It's an
completion of their
understatement.
program. Yeah, to try to make sure that they qualified for the international grad TR to PR. And there's this strange in between period. So let's say you have finished your classes, you've finished your exams, but you don't yet have a letter of authorization or a letter of completion from your school, either an email or an official letter from them, or maybe your final transcript. If you don't have those things, then technically immigration's interpretation is you're not able to continue to work part-time. So 186 sub V doesn't apply if you are in this weird in-between world of having completed your studies, but you haven't filed your postgrad work permit. So what they said was you've got to stop working part-time or at all as soon as you get notification, the earliest that you get notification from your school that you've completed your program. You can only start working under 186 sub W if your study permit was still valid and you applied to extend to change your status to a postgrad work permit if you were eligible for that. So if you keep scrolling down, this was way back in April.
It was.
But it's that one. Can students be working after the end of their studies in Canada? So that's that blog post article there. So make sure that you stopped working part-time until you file your postgrad work permit application. But once you do file your postgrad work permit application, as long as your study permit was still valid, as long as you were attending a DLI and your program was eligible for PGWP, then hey, as soon as you file that application, you can start counting full-time work experience that you can count for CEC Canadian Work Experience hours.
Yep. And I'll just point out right here a nice little helpful chart that Alicia put together, just talking about time periods and working off campus while on a study permit, and just helping you to understand really where those cutoffs are and where those gaps are. And like Alicia said in the beginning, if you're going through express entry, this is important because it comes back to whether or not you've actually worked without authorization. And if you do, you need to disclose that to IRCC. That's the position we take. And if I jump back here, Alicia, to the previous page, and there's this database of blog posts is increasing and increasing. They have to check out the scary misrep, and that's another video that we have here, posted on our social channels on YouTube, and we've done a live stream on that as well on October 28th. So our viewers will have to pay attention to that. Check it out.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, when can you count that Canadian work experience? If you've got that postgrad work permit, you can count it. So that's in the ministerial, and well, it's actually in Regulation 186 sub W. And then the next thing is, of course, you've got to maintain your status. You can't lose your status. And then sometimes people are asking about, okay, well, what happens if you've got your postgrad work permit, but you can't find an employer? Can you be self-employed under a postgrad work permit? Well,
Yep.
the answer is, for sure, you can be self-employed under a postgrad work permit. However, self-employment does not count for Canadian work experience. You cannot use self-employment in order to qualify for CEC. So that's the bad news.
Indeed.
Yeah. And then the next thing is that, sometimes people get creative and it still says, yes, full-time
Yep.
experience is a combination of full-time or part-time work experience, but it still can't exceed that 30 hours a
Yep.
week.
30 hours.
Yeah. So sometimes people get creative and they say, well, wait a minute, I've got a spouse. And so maybe if I apply and I have an accompanying spouse, maybe if my spouse was here in Canada while I was a student, and they had an open spousal work permit, maybe my spouse can get points for Canadian work experience. But immigration has thought of this too. And so if you look back at the ministerial instructions, there's another section, section 19, that basically, there's points for the accompanying spouse, and then it goes through official language of the spouse, and then it goes through Canadian work experience of the spouse. And so if you're the principal applicant and you were on the study permit and you had a spouse who was on an open spousal work permit, if you keep scrolling down, there's subsection 8, so 19 sub 8 of the ministerial instructions, and it basically says the same thing. So for the purposes of Canadian work experience, if the accompanying spouse is there on an open spousal work permit, but the principal applicant was engaged in full-time studies, you can't count that either. So it's the same thing. It can't be self-employment or unauthorized work by the principal applicant for national, and you have to maintain status. It can't exceed 30 hours, and the foreign national couldn't have been on full-time studies either.
Yep. Rules apply equally.
Yeah. So the rules apply equally, and there's not a lot of way to get around it unless you can show that you've graduated from your program, you've got that postgrad, and you start accumulating. And it's really tough. And this is why whenever we're talking to somebody and they're trying to decide, well, do I go for a program that's 2 years or 1 year in duration? It is really hard for people who only were able to get a 1 year program or could only afford to pay for
Yeah.
international tuition fees for a 1 year program, because the instant that you complete your program, you've got to find a full-time job. And if you can't meet 12 months of continuous work there, then you're not going to qualify for CEC.
Yeah. That is one of the things that we've said repeatedly here at the firm. If anyone is advising you to take a 1 year program, well, you better think that through very, very carefully and have a very clear plan. There may be a circumstance where it makes sense for you to do that, but 1 year program equates to a 1 year work permit. And like Alicia said, it is extremely difficult unless you already have a job lined up and you know you're going to be able to hit the pavement running, as we say. Often we've seen our clients come to us booking consults when they're short, maybe 2 weeks short of meeting their 1 year minimum for the CEC. And when you go to school for 2 years, that results in how many years on your postgrad, Alicia?
Yeah, and this could be a whole other article, but
Yeah,
postgrad is set the minimum requirement. It's got to be an 8-month program. If you have an 8-month program of studies, then you get an 8-month postgrad. If you've got a 1 year, you get a 1 year. If you've got a 2 year, well, wait a minute, you get a bonus year. You get a
bonus.
3-year postgrad work
Yeah,
permit.
yeah, it's a big deal. And it gives you a buffer for,
Mhm.
say, a pandemic, right? And it's interesting, Alicia, because people think, well, if we can't count, and take the first example that you gave, where if an individual is no longer in school or the school's closed, well, there were a lot of people in that situation, and IRCC knew that. So what did they do? They created a separate work permit under a public policy to grant an additional 18 months of eligibility to apply for a new form of post-grad work permit, to compensate for the fact that that year was lost when they potentially when they weren't able to work, and even when it came to the individuals that were on post-grad work permits who had just were unable to find a job. So it was kind of like a combo. They all designed to help these international students ensure that they had the work experience that they need. So very interesting.
Yeah. And then the last thing is just circling back to the matrix, because sometimes what happened was people couldn't find a high skilled job, and so they took whatever job was available to them. And when the regulations are talking, or when the ministerial instructions were talking about a knock A, B, or O job, high skilled, or when that's a minimum eligibility requirement for CEC, people sometimes don't understand how to figure out, well, what is a knock A, B, or O? How do you find that skill level? And the easiest way that I find is to go to the matrix. So if you my blog article has a link to the matrix here, but you can look it up as well. And you're going to look at the 2016 version of the knock. So there's a older 2011 version. There will be a new version coming out
Yeah.
sometime next year, but it's not out yet.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
you can see will only be used by ESDC in late 2022. So what people don't see from this is that IRCC still has to adopt this. And Alicia, I have seen a ton of YouTube videos and things like that, everybody fear mongering about the new proposed 5-digit codes and how it will impact on knock level B uh, candidates. And I can tell you, we will absolutely talk about that issue when we really know how it will impact on immigration. Right now, there's a whole lot of speculation. They talk about late 2022. Today, I just finished earlier, just before our recording of this video, a meeting with the heads of ESDC, and we addressed this and we talked about it. And I kind of chided them a little bit. I said, well, late 2022, you can probably tack another 6 months onto that. And, I'm not saying that they were nodding their heads. I'm not saying that. But the reality is I personally, I think we're not going to see an actual full blown implementation by IRCC until early 2023. So,
Yeah.
there's no guarantee, and that's just me speculating, but it's a reality. So we're operating off of the 2016 version
16.
here. We'll be continuing to operate off of that one right here. You can see.
Yeah. So and just to that point too, Mark, there was a little bit of an interesting between 2011 switching over to the 2016 version. Keep in mind that there's a difference between ESDC, which is also called Service Canada, and IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada. And sometimes you get into a strange in-between world where, especially if you're an employer and you're doing a labor market impact assessment, well, if you're in that in-between world where ESDC has not yet adopted the new version of the NOC, filing a job through the job bank gets a little bit complex because there might be changes in your NOC codes.
Yep.
But we'll have to deal with that. We'll see what happens when they roll out the new 2021 NOC. So
You bet. And that's a good segue too. You can go over to the Canadian Immigration Institute YouTube channel, and our LMIA guide for high wage positions is actually in there. So you can check that out, or the employer that wants to hire you, just to make sense of that, because I know I covered aspects of that in that course as well.
and yeah, for anybody, when you're looking at this NOC matrix, take a look at the skill level. So if you see right at the top there, you've got a few columns. You've got management occupations, which are O. You've got occupations that usually require university education is skill level A. Occupations that usually require college education or specialized training or apprenticeship is B. So if your NOC code starts with the first two digits that are in column O, A, or B, so you'll be able to check your NOC code is 4 digits right now, and the first two digits are listed in this table. So take a look at the first two digits of your NOC, make sure that you're choosing the right NOC, but it's got to be within O, A, or B. If you have taken a job because you had to in C or D, that's fine, you can work, but you're not going to be able to claim Canadian work experience under CEC for a NOC C or D job, which starts with any of the two digits in NOC C or D columns.
And if you want to be a real geek, it's the second digit that you're looking for. So if the second digit is a 3 or lower, then it's skilled. If that second digit of your 4-digit NOC code, and these are the first two digits in the NOC code. So if we click on 14 here, you can see that then there's a subgroup and then the actual position underneath it. But these first two digits, anything that's a 1, 4, 5, or even 2, 4, if the second digit is 4 or higher, then you know that's a low skill position and won't qualify for under the Federal Skilled Worker Program or CEC under Express Entry.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a nice little foray into just interpreting the NOC to make sure where you are.
Yep, absolutely. And in our Express Entry DIY course, we also have some really cool materials that are available to help you figure out which of those NOCs are actually going to fit. And so, yes, deciding on what's Canadian experience is super important, but also identifying that proper NOC is a critical component, and both can cause your application to be bounced and you to lose your opportunity potentially forever if you get them wrong. Any additional things, Alicia, that you want to add in as we get ready to wrap up our little session on the mysterious aspects of the Canadian work experience?
I think just, COVID and the pandemic has changed quite a bit in terms of disrupting people's lives. And so there are situations that are pretty unique because of that, with school closures, and just really making sure that when you're counting your Canadian experience, your Canadian work experience, it's got to meet that definition under the ministerial instructions. And if you have any concerns or you're not sure, then for sure book a consultation because
Yep.
you want to get it right. You might only have one chance to file that application.
Yeah, absolutely. All the links are below in the description. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you, Alicia. It was great having you join me. And we'll see you all again soon with another video on Express Entry, helping you avoid those pitfalls. Take care.